Two racist teachers bully black girl in class, then freeze when they discover she's the principal's daughter. Zoe Johnson stood at the entrance of Westfield High School, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. At 15, she was starting her sophomore year at a new school in a new town, and the butterflies in her stomach were working overtime. Zoe's dark skin and curly hair set her apart in the predominantly white suburb her family had recently moved to, but she was determined to make the best of this fresh start. Zoe's father, Dr. Marcus Johnson, had recently been appointed as the new principal of Westfield High. It was a prestigious position and a significant step in his career, but it also meant uprooting the family from their diverse urban neighborhood to this affluent, mostly white community. Dr. Johnson, aware of the challenges his daughter might face, had decided to keep their relationship under wraps for the first few months. He wanted Zoe to have the chance to establish herself on her own merits, without the complications that could come from being known as the principal's daughter. As Zoe navigated the crowded hallways, she couldn't help but notice the curious glances and whispers that followed her. She was used to being one of the few black students in her advanced classes, but here at Westfield, she seemed to be one of the few black students, period. Among the sea of unfamiliar faces, two stood out to Zoe. Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery, her new English and history teachers respectively, watched her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Both were longtime fixtures at Westfield High, known for their rigorous teaching styles and traditional values. Mr. Thompson, a tall man in his late 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, had been teaching at Westfield for over 3 decades. He prided himself on upholding what he called academic standards and was known for his strict, often inflexible approach to education. Ms. Avery, slightly younger but no less intimidating, had a reputation for favoring students from good families, a thinly veiled code for the wealthy, white elite of the community. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer clothes spoke of a woman who valued appearance and status above all else. As Zoe made her way to her first class, she steeled herself for the challenges ahead. She was no stranger to prejudice, but she was determined to excel, to prove that she belonged in the advanced courses she had been placed in. Little did she know that the greatest test of her resilience would come not from her peers, but from the very teachers who were supposed to guide and support her. With a deep breath, Zoe stepped into Mr. Thompson's English class, unaware that she was about to become the center of a conflict that would shake Westfield High to its very foundations. The first few weeks of school passed in a blur of new faces, challenging coursework, and the constant feeling of being under a microscope. Zoe threw herself into her studies, determined to prove that she belonged in the advanced classes she had been placed in. But as the days went by, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, particularly in Mr. Thompson's English class and Miss Avery's history class. It started with small things. In English, Mr. Thompson seemed to go out of his way to find fault with Zoe's work. Her essays, which had always earned high marks at her previous school, were now coming back covered in red ink, with comments about poor grammar and lack of understanding of the material. One day, as Mr. Thompson was handing back their latest assignments, he paused at Zoe's desk. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice carrying across the silent classroom, "I'm beginning to wonder if you wouldn't be better suited to a less challenging class. Perhaps you're not quite ready for AP-level work." Zoe felt her cheeks burn as she accepted her paper, marked with a glaring C. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some curious, others smirking. I can do better, Mr. Thompson," she managed to stammer out. "We'll see," he replied, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. The situation in Miss Avery's history class was no better. While Mr. Thompson's jabs were at least ostensibly about academics, Miss Avery's comments often strayed into more personal territory. During a discussion about the Civil War, Miss Avery called on Zoe. "Miss Johnson, perhaps you can share your unique perspective on this topic," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Zoe, caught off guard, began to speak about the economic factors that contributed to the conflict. But Miss Avery cut her off. "I was rather hoping you might tell us about the, shall we say, cultural aspects. Surely you have some family stories to share?" The implication was clear, and Zoe felt a wave of anger and humiliation wash over her. "My family is from Detroit, Miss Avery," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We don't have any direct connection to the Civil War era." Miss Avery's eyebrows rose in feigned surprise. "Oh, how interesting. I just assumed." She let the sentence hang, filling the air with unspoken assumptions and prejudices. Zoe could hear a few snickers from her classmates, and she sank lower in her seat, wishing she could disappear. As the weeks went on, the incidents began to pile up. In English, Mr. Thompson consistently called on Zoe to read passages aloud, then critiqued her pronunciation mercilessly. "Enunciate, Miss Johnson," he would say, exaggerating his own speech as if speaking to a small child. "King's English, if you please." In history, Miss Avery developed a habit of using Zoe as an example in her lectures, often in ways that highlighted racial stereotypes. "Miss Johnson, I'm sure you can tell us all about the challenges of inner-city life," she would say, despite Zoe's repeated insistence that she had grown up in a middle-class suburb. The constant microaggressions were taking their toll. Zoe, once confident and outspoken, became quieter in class. She second-guessed every answer, every essay, afraid of giving Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery more ammunition. Her grades, once stellar, began to slip. At home, Zoe struggled with whether to tell her parents what was happening. She knew her father, in his position as principal, could put a stop to it immediately. But she also felt a fierce determination to handle this on her own, to prove that she could overcome these obstacles without running to her dad for help. The situation came to a head one afternoon in English class. Mr. Thompson was discussing the works of Shakespeare, waxing poetic about the bard's mastery of the English language. "Of course," he added with a pointed look at Zoe, "some people might find his sophisticated use of language challenging." Something in Zoe snapped. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word, "I understand Shakespeare just fine. What I don't understand is why you seem to think I'm incapable of grasping complex literature simply because of the color of my skin." A hush fell over the classroom. Mr. Thompson's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Miss Johnson," he sputtered, "that is entirely inappropriate. I think you need to leave my classroom immediately." As Zoe gathered her things, she could feel the mixture of shock and admiration on her classmates' faces. She walked out with her head held high, but her hands were shaking. She knew this act of defiance would have consequences, but in that moment, she didn't care. Something had to change, and if no one else was going to do anything about it, it would have to be her. The fallout from Zoe's confrontation with Mr. Thompson was immediate and far-reaching. By the end of the school day, the story had spread throughout Westfield High, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some hailed Zoe as a hero for standing up to a notoriously strict teacher, while others criticized her for what they saw as disrespect towards authority. Zoe found herself called to the vice principal's office, where she sat nervously, waiting for the axe to fall. Mr. Daniels, a middle-aged man with a kind face, looked at her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Miss Johnson," he began, "I understand there was an incident in Mr. Thompson's class today. Would you like to tell me your side of the story?" Taking a deep breath, Zoe recounted not just the events of that day, but the pattern of behavior she had experienced from both Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery since the beginning of the school year. As she spoke, she could see Mr. Daniels' expression changing from skepticism to shock, and finally to something that looked like guilt. "Zoe," he said when she had finished, "I want you to know that this kind of behavior is not acceptable at Westfield High. We pride ourselves on being an inclusive community. I'm sorry you've had to deal with this." Zoe nodded, relieved to be believed but still wary. "What's going to happen now?" she asked. Mr. Daniels sighed. "Well, normally in a case like this, we would need to conduct a thorough investigation. We'd need to speak with Mr. Thompson, Miss Avery, and other students to corroborate your story. It's a delicate situation, given the tenure and reputation of the teachers involved." Zoe felt her heart sink. She knew how these things often went, a long, drawn-out process that would likely end with a slap on the wrist for the teachers and increased scrutiny on her. But then Mr. Daniels continued, "However, given the seriousness of your allegations and the unique circumstances of your situation, I think we need to involve the principal immediately." Zoe's eyes widened. The principal? But before she could finish her thought, there was a knock at the door. It opened to reveal Dr. Marcus Johnson, Zoe's father and the principal of Westfield High. The look on his face was one Zoe had never seen before, a mixture of parental concern and professional fury. "Dad?" Zoe said, her voice small. Mr. Daniels looked between Zoe and Dr. Johnson, realization dawning on his face. "Dad?" he repeated. "Dr. Johnson, is Zoe your—" "My daughter, yes," Dr. Johnson confirmed, his voice tight with controlled anger. A fact that, it seems, we should have made public from the start. The room fell into a stunned silence as the implications of this revelation sank in. Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery hadn't just been bullying any student. They had been targeting the principal's daughter. Dr. Johnson turned to Zoe, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I thought by keeping our relationship quiet, I was giving you a chance to establish yourself on your own terms. I never imagined." Zoe stood up and hugged her father, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. The secret was out, and with it, the full weight of what had been happening could finally be addressed. As father and daughter embraced, Mr. Daniels cleared his throat awkwardly. "Dr. Johnson, I think we need to call an emergency staff meeting. This situation, it needs to be dealt with immediately." Dr. Johnson nodded, his arm still around Zoe's shoulders. "Yes, it does, and it will be." He looked down at his daughter, a mix of pride and determination in his eyes. "Things are going to change around here, Zoe. I promise you that." As they left Mr. Daniels' office, Zoe felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief at finally having the truth out, apprehension about what would come next, and a growing sense that this revelation was just the beginning of a much larger story. In the days following the revelation of Zoe's true identity, Westfield High was abuzz with activity. Dr. Johnson had called an emergency staff meeting where he laid out in no uncertain terms the seriousness of the situation and his zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination or bullying. Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery were placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The news spread quickly through the school, eliciting a range of reactions from students and staff alike. Some were shocked and outraged by the teachers' behavior, while others defended them, arguing that their tough teaching styles were being misconstrued. Amidst all this chaos, Zoe found herself at a crossroads. She could step back and let her father handle everything, or she could take an active role in addressing the issues that had been brought to light. After much soul-searching, Zoe made her decision. "Dad," she said one evening as they sat in his home office, "I want to be part of the solution. What happened to me? I don't think it's an isolated incident. And I don't think it's just about race either. There are other students who've been struggling, who've been made to feel like they don't belong." Dr. Johnson looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "What are you suggesting, Zoe?" "I want to start a student advocacy group," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "A safe space where students can share their experiences and work together to make real changes in the school. And I want to be involved in the process of addressing what happened with Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery." Dr. Johnson was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Zoe, I'm incredibly proud of you for wanting to take this on. But are you sure you're ready for the attention and potential backlash this could bring?" Zoe nodded firmly. "I'm sure, Dad. I can't just sit back and do nothing, not when I have the opportunity to make a real difference." With her father's blessing, Zoe set her plan into motion. She reached out to fellow students, including some who had initially been skeptical of her, to form the core of the advocacy group. She worked with the school counselor to create a framework for addressing student concerns and promoting inclusivity. The consequences of Zoe's decision were immediate and far-reaching. As word of her initiative spread, students who had previously suffered in silence began to come forward with their own stories. It wasn't just racial discrimination they reported, but instances of sexism, homophobia, and bias against students with disabilities or from lower-income backgrounds. Zoe's inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, others accusatory. She was praised for her bravery by some and labeled a troublemaker by others. The local media caught wind of the story, and suddenly Zoe found herself thrust into the spotlight as the face of a growing movement for change at Westfield High. The atmosphere at school changed dramatically. Students who had once ignored Zoe now approached her to share their experiences or offer support. But there was also tension. Friends of Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery, both students and fellow teachers, viewed Zoe with hostility, seeing her as the cause of their mentor's troubles. One particularly difficult consequence came in the form of a confrontation with Jessica, Mr. Thompson's daughter and a senior at Westfield. Jessica cornered Zoe in the hallway between classes, her face flushed with anger. "You had no right," Jessica hissed. "My dad has given his whole life to this school, and you've ruined everything. Do you have any idea what this is doing to my family?" Zoe, taken aback by the raw emotion in Jessica's voice, struggled to find the right words. "Jessica, I'm sorry your family is going through this. But what your dad did, what Miss Avery did, it wasn't right. It wasn't just about me." Jessica's eyes filled with tears of frustration. "You don't understand anything," she said before storming off, leaving Zoe shaken and more aware than ever of the complex web of relationships and loyalties her actions had disrupted. As the weeks passed, Zoe found herself juggling her newfound role as a student leader with her academic responsibilities and the ongoing investigation into Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery's conduct. The strain began to show. Her grades, which had just begun to recover, started to slip again as she poured her energy into the advocacy group and cooperated with the school board's investigation. Dr. Johnson, seeing his daughter's struggle, grappled with his dual role as her father and as the school's principal. He was immensely proud of Zoe's courage and commitment, but he also worried about the toll it was taking on her. "Zoe," he said one night, finding her still awake and working on advocacy group plans well past midnight, "I'm concerned. You're taking on so much. Are you sure you're not spreading yourself too thin?" Zoe looked up from her laptop, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. "I can handle it, Dad. This is important." Dr. Johnson sat down next to her, his face etched with concern. "It is important, sweetheart, but so is your well-being. We need to find a balance." As they talked into the night, Zoe began to realize the full weight of the consequences of her decision. She had set in motion changes that were affecting not just her life, but the lives of everyone at Westfield High. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and overwhelming all at once. The next day at school, Zoe faced another unexpected consequence of her actions. As she walked into her math class, she noticed a group of students huddled together, whispering and casting furtive glances her way. When they saw her, they quickly dispersed, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with tension. Later, she overheard a snippet of conversation that made her blood run cold. "I heard she's trying to get rid of all the white teachers," one student was saying. "My dad says she and her father are pushing some kind of radical agenda." Zoe felt a wave of despair wash over her. This wasn't what she wanted at all. Her goal had been to create understanding, not more division. She realized that in trying to fix one problem, she might have inadvertently created others. As the day wore on, Zoe grappled with the unintended consequences of her decision. She had wanted to be a voice for change, but she hadn't fully considered how her actions might be perceived or misinterpreted by others. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders, leaving her questioning whether she had made the right choice after all. While Zoe was navigating the tumultuous waters of her advocacy work, a secondary plot was unfolding within the walls of Westfield High. The investigation into Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery's conduct had opened a Pandora's box of long-buried issues and tensions among the staff. Ms. Rodriguez, a young Latina teacher who had joined the faculty the previous year, found herself unexpectedly at the center of this secondary drama. She had always felt like an outsider among the predominantly white, older staff, but had kept her head down and focused on her students. Now, with the spotlight on issues of discrimination at Westfield, she felt compelled to speak up. During a tense staff meeting called to discuss the ongoing investigation, Ms. Rodriguez stood up, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice steady. "What happened with Zoe isn't an isolated incident," she said. "There's a culture of subtle discrimination that's been allowed to fester here for years. I've experienced it myself, and I've seen it happen to students. Her words sent a ripple through the room. Some teachers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Daniels, the vice principal, looked particularly troubled. "Why haven't you said anything before, Miss Rodriguez?" he asked. She gave a bitter laugh. "Would you have listened? It's easy to dismiss these things when they're not happening to you." As the meeting continued, more teachers began to share their experiences. Mr. Lee, a middle-aged Asian American science teacher, talked about the casual racism he'd encountered in the staff room. Mrs. Johnson, no relation to Zoe, an older black teacher nearing retirement, spoke about how she'd been passed over for department head positions multiple times in favor of less experienced white colleagues. The revelations kept coming, painting a picture of a school where discrimination had become so normalized that many hadn't even recognized it for what it was. Dr. Johnson listened to it all, his expression growing more grave with each story. As the meeting drew to a close, he addressed the staff. "It's clear that the issues at Westfield run deeper than any of us realized," he said. "This isn't just about 2 teachers or 1 student. We need systemic change, and it needs to start with us." In the days that followed, the secondary plot continued to develop. Miss Rodriguez found herself becoming an unofficial leader among the teachers pushing for change. She organized meetings, collected testimonies, and worked on drafting proposals for new diversity and inclusion policies. But not everyone was on board with these changes. A group of older teachers, led by Mr. Green from the math department, pushed back against what they saw as an attack on the school's traditions and standards. "We can't lower our expectations in the name of inclusivity," Mr. Green argued during one heated debate. "Westfield's reputation is built on academic excellence." Ms. Rodriguez countered, "No one's talking about lowering standards. We're talking about creating an environment where every student has an equal opportunity to meet those standards." As this conflict played out among the staff, it began to impact the students as well. The school became increasingly divided, with some rallying behind Ms. Rodriguez and the push for change, while others sided with Mr. Green and the old guard. Zoe, already struggling with the consequences of her own actions, now found herself caught in the crossfire of this larger battle. She realized that the issues at Westfield were far more complex and deeply rooted than she had initially thought. The path forward was becoming increasingly unclear, and she wasn't sure if she was prepared for the long and difficult journey ahead. As the tensions at Westfield High continued to simmer, an unexpected relationship began to develop between Zoe and Jessica, Mr. Thompson's daughter. Their initial confrontation in the hallway had left both girls shaken, but it had also planted the seeds of a tentative understanding. One afternoon, Zoe was working alone in the library when Jessica approached her table. Zoe tensed, preparing for another confrontation, but Jessica's demeanor was different this time. Less angry, more uncertain. "Can we talk?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zoe nodded, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. As Jessica sat down, Zoe could see the toll the past few weeks had taken on her. The usually confident senior looked tired and stressed, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Jessica began. "About it not just being about you. I think I understand a little better now." Zoe listened as Jessica opened up about her own experiences. She talked about the pressure she'd always felt as a teacher's daughter, the expectation to be perfect, to never question authority. She shared stories of times she'd witnessed her father's harsh treatment of students, but had convinced herself it was just his way of maintaining high standards. "I never thought about how it might feel to be on the receiving end of that," Jessica admitted, "especially if you already felt like an outsider." As they talked, Zoe found herself sharing more about her own experiences, not just the recent incidents with Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery, but the everyday challenges of being one of the few black students in a predominantly white school. Their conversation lasted for hours, stretching long past the time the library closed. As they walked out together, both girls felt a shift in their relationship. They weren't friends, not yet, but they had found common ground in their shared experiences of feeling pressured to live up to others' expectations. Over the next few weeks, Zoe and Jessica began to seek each other out. They would meet in the library or the cafeteria, sometimes just to talk, other times to work on homework together. Their budding friendship didn't go unnoticed by their classmates, many of whom were puzzled by this unlikely pairing. One day, as they were leaving the cafeteria together, they overheard a group of students whispering. "I bet Zoe's just using Jessica to get dirt on Mr. Thompson," one girl said. "Or maybe Jessica's spying for her dad," another suggested. Jessica tensed, ready to confront the gossipers, but Zoe put a hand on her arm. "Let it go," she said quietly. "They don't understand." As they walked away, Jessica turned to Zoe. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you not let it get to you?" Zoe shrugged. "Who says it doesn't get to me? I just try to remember that their opinions say more about them than about me." This exchange marked another turning point in their relationship. Jessica began to see firsthand the kind of prejudice and assumptions Zoe dealt with on a daily basis. It opened her eyes to realities she had previously been blind to, and it strengthened her resolve to be a better ally. For Zoe, her growing friendship with Jessica provided an unexpected source of support and understanding. Jessica's insider perspective on the school's dynamics and her father's thought processes helped Zoe navigate the complex situation more effectively. Their friendship also had a ripple effect on the school community. Seeing Zoe and Jessica together challenged the narratives that had formed around the controversy. It showed that understanding and reconciliation were possible, even in the midst of conflict. One afternoon, as they were working on a project for Zoe's advocacy group, Jessica looked up at Zoe with a serious expression. "I want you to know," she said, "that no matter what happens with my dad, I support what you're doing. It's not easy for me, but it's the right thing." Zoe felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." As they continued to work, Zoe reflected on how far they had come. From adversaries to allies, their relationship had become a symbol of the change that was possible at Westfield High. It wasn't always easy, and they still had their disagreements, but their friendship had become a source of strength for both of them as they navigated the challenging weeks ahead. Their evolving relationship served as a microcosm of the larger changes happening at Westfield. It showed that with open communication, empathy, and a willingness to challenge one's own assumptions, bridges could be built across even the widest divides. As Zoe and Jessica continued to grow closer, they became living proof that understanding and reconciliation were not only possible, but essential in creating a truly inclusive community. The tension that had been building at Westfield High for weeks finally came to a head on a crisp autumn morning. The school board had called a public meeting to discuss the findings of their investigation into Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery's conduct, as well as the broader issues of discrimination at the school. The school auditorium was packed to capacity. Students, parents, teachers, and community members filled every seat, with more people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air was thick with anticipation and anxiety. Zoe sat in the front row, flanked by her parents on one side and Jessica on the other. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, some supportive, others hostile. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held her head high, determined to face whatever was coming. As the board members took their seats on the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. Dr. Johnson stepped up to the podium, his face grave. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "The events of the past few weeks have shaken our community to its core. Today, we're here to address these issues head-on and chart a path forward." He went on to outline the findings of the investigation. The evidence against Mr. Thompson and Ms. Avery was damning. Not only had they engaged in discriminatory behavior towards Zoe, but the investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar incidents stretching back years. As Dr. Johnson spoke, Zoe could hear muffled sobs coming from behind her. She turned to see Mr. Thompson's wife crying quietly, while Jessica sat stone-faced, her eyes fixed on the stage. But the revelations didn't stop there. Dr. Johnson went on to address the broader culture of discrimination at Westfield, citing testimony from students and teachers alike. He spoke of subtle biases, of opportunities denied, of voices silenced. As he concluded his summary, Dr. Johnson paused, his eyes scanning the room. "It's clear," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "that we have failed many of our students and staff. For that, I apologize. But an apology is not enough. We need action. He then introduced Ms. Rodriguez, inviting her to present the proposals for change that she and other teachers had developed. As Ms. Rodriguez began to speak, outlining plans for diversity training, curriculum revisions, and new hiring practices, a commotion erupted in the back of the auditorium. Mr. Green, the math teacher, who had been vocal in his opposition to these changes, stood up. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You're going to destroy everything that makes Westfield great, all because of one student's complaints?" His outburst seemed to open the floodgates. Suddenly, the auditorium was filled with shouting voices. Parents argued with each other, teachers defended their positions, students called out their experiences. In the midst of the chaos, Zoe stood up. "Stop!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the noise. To her surprise, the room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. With shaking legs but a steady voice, Zoe addressed the crowd. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about all of us. Every student who's ever felt like they don't belong. Every teacher who's been afraid to speak up. Every parent who's worried about their child's future. We have a chance to make real change here, to create a school where everyone is truly welcome and supported. But we can only do it if we work together." As Zoe spoke, she could see the anger and fear on people's faces, slowly giving way to thoughtfulness and, in some cases, shame. Her words seemed to cut through the defensiveness and finger-pointing, reminding everyone of the real issues at stake. When she finished, there was a moment of profound silence. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. The applause spread, growing into a thunderous ovation. In that moment, as Zoe stood before her community, both vulnerable and strong, something shifted. The path forward was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like real change might be possible. In the wake of the tumultuous school board meeting, Westfield High entered a period of intense self-examination and attempted reconciliation. Dr. Johnson, recognizing the need for expert help, brought in a team of diversity and inclusion consultants to guide the process. The consultants began by organizing a series of workshops and listening sessions for students, teachers, and parents. These sessions were designed to create safe spaces for people to share their experiences and perspectives, and to begin the difficult work of addressing biases and building empathy. Zoe found herself at the center of many of these discussions, often called upon to share her story. It was emotionally draining work, but she could see the impact it was having. Slowly but surely, people who had been defensive or dismissive were starting to listen and understand. One particularly powerful moment came during a student-led session. A white student named Ryan, who had initially been one of Zoe's harshest critics, stood up to speak. I owe Zoe an apology," he said, his voice shaking. "I said some pretty awful things about her when all this started. I thought she was just causing trouble, trying to get attention. But listening to her and others these past few weeks, I realize now how wrong I was. How blind I've been to what others go through." His words seemed to open a floodgate. Other students began to stand up, sharing their own realizations and apologies. It wasn't a magical fix. Years of ingrained biases couldn't be erased in a single moment. But it was a start. The process of resolution wasn't smooth or easy. There were heated arguments, tears, and moments of frustration. Some people, like Mr. Green, remained stubbornly opposed to change, arguing that the school was overreacting to isolated incidents. One of the most challenging aspects of the resolution process was dealing with Mr. Thompson and Ms. Avery. Both teachers had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, but the question of their future at Westfield remained a contentious issue. Dr. Johnson organized a mediation session between the teachers, Zoe and her parents, and representatives from the school board. It was a tense and emotional meeting. Mr. Thompson, his face haggard from weeks of stress, spoke first. "I want to apologize," he said, looking directly at Zoe. "My behavior was inexcusable. I've spent my entire career believing I was upholding high standards, but I now see that I was letting my biases affect how I treated students. I'm deeply ashamed." Miss Avery's apology was less straightforward. "I never meant to make anyone feel unwelcome," she said. "I simply believed in maintaining the traditions and standards that have made Westfield great." Zoe listened to their words, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of her was angry, wanting them to fully acknowledge the harm they had caused. Another part recognized the difficulty of confronting one's own biases and appreciated their effort to apologize. After a moment of tense silence, Zoe spoke. "Thank you for your apologies," she said, her voice steady. "But I think it's important to understand that this isn't just about me. It's about every student who's ever felt marginalized or underestimated because of their race or any other aspect of their identity. How do we make sure this never happens again?" Dr. Johnson nodded, picking up on Zoe's point. "That's the real question we need to address. Mr. Thompson, Miss Avery, are you willing to be part of the solution moving forward?" Both teachers nodded, though Miss Avery still looked uncertain. "What exactly would that entail?" she asked. The discussion that followed was long and often difficult. They talked about mandatory diversity training, about revising curricula to be more inclusive, about creating mentoring programs for students of color. Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery listened, sometimes defensively, sometimes with growing understanding. By the end of the session, a tentative plan had been formed. Both teachers would undergo extensive retraining before any decision was made about their return to the classroom. They would also participate in the school's new diversity initiatives, sharing their experiences as part of the education process for other teachers and students. As the meeting concluded, Jessica, who had been silently observing, approached Zoe. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry for what my dad did. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that." Zoe gave her a small smile. "Thanks, Jessica. Your support means a lot." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as Westfield High began to implement its new policies. Curriculum committees were formed to review and revise course materials. The school brought in speakers from diverse backgrounds to share their experiences and insights. A new student council was established with representatives from various racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups to ensure that student concerns would be heard and addressed. Not everything went smoothly. There were heated debates about which books should be added to or removed from reading lists. Some parents complained that the new policies were too extreme, while others argued they didn't go far enough. The local media continued to follow the story, adding pressure to an already tense situation. Through it all, Zoe remained at the center of the storm. She worked tirelessly on the student council, participated in panel discussions, and continued to share her story. The stress took its toll. There were nights when she cried from exhaustion and frustration, but she also felt a growing sense of pride in the changes she was helping to create. One afternoon, as Zoe was leaving a particularly grueling council meeting, she ran into Mr. Daniels, the vice principal. He stopped her in the hallway, a serious expression on his face. "Zoe," he said, "I owe you an apology. When you first came to me about Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery, I didn't take your concerns seriously enough. I was too focused on protecting the school's reputation and not enough on protecting our students. I'm sorry." Zoe was taken aback by his words. "Thank you, Mr. Daniels," she said. "That means a lot." He nodded, then added, "You've shown remarkable strength and maturity through all of this. Whatever happens next, you should be proud of yourself." As Zoe walked away from that conversation, she felt a glimmer of hope. Change was happening, slowly but surely. It wasn't perfect, and there was still a long way to go, but for the first time since this all began, she felt like they were on the right path. The conflict resolution process at Westfield High was far from over. There would be more difficult conversations, more setbacks, more moments of doubt. But as Zoe looked around at her fellow students, at the teachers who were working to do better, at her father who was leading the charge for change, she knew that they had taken the first crucial steps towards creating a truly inclusive community. As the school year progressed, the changes at Westfield High began to take root. The initial shock and controversy had given way to a new normal, one where conversations about race and inclusivity were no longer taboo, but an integral part of daily life. The turning point came unexpectedly, during a routine school assembly. Dr. Johnson had invited a diverse panel of alumni to speak about their experiences at Westfield and their journeys after graduation. As the speakers shared their stories, some inspiring, some heartbreaking, a palpable shift occurred in the auditorium. Students who had been skeptical of the new initiatives listened with growing interest. Teachers who had resisted change found themselves nodding in agreement. Even Mr. Green, who had been one of the most vocal opponents of the diversity programs, was seen wiping away a tear as a former student spoke about the impact of feeling unseen and undervalued during her time at Westfield. After the assembly, there was a buzz of excited conversation in the hallways. Students from different social groups were talking to each other, sharing their reactions and insights. Zoe overheard snippets of conversation that made her heart swell with hope. "I never realized. We should start a club too. Maybe we could organize a..." It was as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of empathy and motivation. Students were no longer waiting for teachers or administrators to lead the way. They were taking initiative, coming up with their own ideas for fostering inclusivity and understanding. Inspired by this surge of student engagement, Dr. Johnson called a meeting with the student council, faculty representatives, and parent volunteers. "I think it's time we take our efforts to the next level," he said. "We've made progress within our school, but what about our wider community?" This suggestion sparked a flurry of ideas. Plans were made for community outreach programs, partnerships with local organizations, and a district-wide student summit on diversity and inclusion. Westfield High was no longer just reacting to a crisis. It was positioning itself as a leader in educational equity. For Zoe, this marked a significant shift in her role as well. She was no longer the face of a controversy, but a respected leader in a movement for positive change. As she looked around the room at the excited faces of her peers and teachers, she felt a sense of pride and purpose that she had never experienced before. Westfield High was entering a new chapter, one filled with challenges, but also with tremendous potential. The path forward was clear. Not easy, but clear, and Zoe was ready to help lead the way. As the school year drew to a close, Zoe found herself sitting on the bleachers overlooking the football field, lost in thought. The past months had been a whirlwind of change, conflict, and growth, and she was only now beginning to fully process everything that had happened. She thought back to the scared, angry girl she had been at the beginning of the year, facing discrimination and feeling powerless. That girl seemed so distant now, almost like a stranger. In her place was a young woman who had found her voice, who had stood up not just for herself but for others, who had helped spark a movement that was changing her school and community. Zoe reflected on the relationships she had formed and how they had evolved. Her friendship with Jessica, once unthinkable, had become one of the most important in her life. They had supported each other through the ups and downs of the past months, learning from each other and growing together. Her relationship with her father had deepened as well. Working together on the school's initiatives had given Zoe a new appreciation for the challenges he faced as a leader, and it had given Dr. Johnson a chance to see his daughter's strength and wisdom firsthand. Even her interactions with Mr. Thompson and Miss Avery had taught her valuable lessons about forgiveness, growth, and the complexity of human nature. While she couldn't forget the hurt they had caused, she had learned to separate their actions from their worth as human beings, to see them as flawed individuals capable of change rather than as irredeemable villains. As Zoe sat there, she realized how much she had grown, not just in confidence, but in empathy and understanding. She had learned to listen to perspectives different from her own, to find common ground with people she initially saw as adversaries, to lead with compassion as well as conviction. She thought about the challenges that still lay ahead. The work of creating a truly inclusive community was far from over. There would be more difficult conversations, more resistance to overcome, more moments of doubt and frustration. But now, Zoe felt prepared to face these challenges. She had tools and support systems that she hadn't had before. A noise behind her interrupted her reverie. She turned to see a group of freshmen approaching, looking nervous but determined. Zoe," one of them said. "We were wondering if you could help us. We want to start a mentoring program for middle schoolers to help them prepare for the transition to high school, especially kids from diverse backgrounds who might be nervous about fitting in. We thought, with your experience..." Zoe felt a warm glow of pride and excitement. This was exactly the kind of initiative she had hoped to inspire. "Of course," she said, smiling. "I'd be happy to help. Tell me more about your ideas." As she listened to the younger students' enthusiastic plans, Zoe reflected on how far they had come. A year ago, these students might have been too intimidated or unaware to even consider such a program. Now, they were taking the lead, looking for ways to make their school more welcoming for the next generation. In that moment, Zoe realized that her legacy at Westfield wouldn't just be the specific changes she had helped implement. It would be this ripple effect, this awakening of awareness and motivation in her fellow students. She had helped create an environment where students felt empowered to make a difference, to challenge the status quo, to strive for a more inclusive and equitable world. As she began brainstorming with the freshmen, Zoe felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope. The journey had been difficult, but it had led her to this moment and to a future full of possibility. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength, the support, and the conviction to face any challenge and to continue working for positive change. On the last day of school, Westfield High buzzed with an energy unlike any other year. Students and teachers alike moved through the halls with a sense of accomplishment and anticipation for what the future would bring. At the final assembly, Dr. Johnson stood before the school community, his face beaming with pride. "This year has been one of tremendous growth and change," he began. "We've faced difficult truths about ourselves and our community. We've had uncomfortable conversations and made hard decisions. But through it all, we've emerged stronger, more united, and more committed to creating a truly inclusive environment where every student can thrive." As Zoe listened to her father's words, she felt a swell of emotion. She looked around at her fellow students, at Jessica, who gave her a thumbs up, at the freshmen she'd been mentoring, their faces shining with excitement for the future, at Ryan, who had become an unexpected ally in their efforts for change. Dr. Johnson continued, "The work we've begun this year is just the beginning. Creating a just and equitable society is an ongoing process, one that requires constant vigilance, self-reflection, and a willingness to grow. But I have faith in each and every one of you to carry this work forward, in your lives at Westfield and beyond." As the assembly concluded and students began to file out for the summer, there was a palpable sense of hope in the air. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But Westfield High had taken the first crucial steps towards real, lasting change. Zoe stood in the doorway of the school, taking one last look before leaving for the summer. She thought about the girl she had been at the beginning of the year and the young woman she had become. The path forward wasn't always clear, but she was ready to walk it, hand in hand with her community, towards a more inclusive and just future.